Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we look at the mayoral race in New York as a kind of window into what's going on with younger voters. Yes, there's a growing interest in not only socialism, apparently more than socialism, but we also step back to consider, why would that be? Are these just blue-haired kids working in coffee shops who are completely innocent of all history? Or does this make some sense when you look at our cultural landscape? So we take a look at that cultural landscape, and we think this will be really helpful to you in putting into perspective the changing vision of America. This is a little bit sobering at times, but ultimately we are hopeful because, as Nathan says, we believe we know the one who runs the world in the first place. So like, share, and subscribe as always. If you'd like to support the work that we do, you can do so by going to www.toltogether.com and click the donate page.
I want to talk about politics today, Cameron, which
Oh no.
we often don't hit head on. And obviously we won't hit it on head on. And it's like, oh, rah, rah, did you vote for this person, cheer for this tribe. But this is a broader reflection on who is it that you're trusting to solve your problems. And it's important that I outline that's where I want to go with this because there are some pretty interesting um, trends isn't the right word, but like little glimmers or flickers of things that let you know that the political future that may be before us will be very different than what it has been in the past. And I think a lot of people would be like, yeah, the entire era of Donald Trump, like him or hate him, you can say is different, has been a different political era. Um, but I'm talking about after this, what comes next, and what are some of the things that we see happening, and then how we as Christians should be thinking about where we're really placing our hope in all of this. One of those kerfuffles is in the Democratic primary for the mayor of New York City, which New York City is not necessarily as New York City goes, so goes the rest of the world. But Zohran Mamdani was elected as the candidate, and a couple things that are interesting for the Democratic side of the ticket there is that he was running against Como, who had pretty much the support and the backing of Wall Street. So Como had all the money thrown at him. Mamdani had money, obviously, but not near to the degree that some of the other candidates did. And so this is a case in which somebody who really captured the ideas of the young people beat kind of the big and old money. And we know that money makes a huge difference in politics. So, and this happens from time to time. But this was a little more noteworthy just in some of the policy that Mamdani has for a long time espoused under his democratic socialist label, which people would be like, is far closer to socialism. And some people would say, when you start using the phrase like take back the means of production, that's even beyond socialism into a little more
Yeah.
just clear cut communism. So things that he would be in favor of, kind of ideas that there shouldn't be billionaires, very high taxes on the wealthy, freezing rent, making government run grocery stores, um, free transportation, a number of things that a lot of, obviously people who have looked at history and or have come from other countries have been like, we've seen this before and this hasn't ended well. So certainly your Wall Street Journal types and American conservatives in general are going to be hypersensitive to anything that has a communist socialist component to it. And he's interested in the fact that he isn't really trying to hide from that. Obviously, very anti-Israel. His dad is a professor at Columbia who supported the Palestinian protest, Israel protest there.
hmm
So very connected to a lot of things that a lot of conservatives would be like, "Oh no, we can't have any of this." Except he's not being sneaky about it. He's like, "Yeah, this is what I think," and he won the Democratic primary. So that that in and of itself is interesting, and you can say whatever you want. But again, we're not going the sky is falling partisanship there. I will point out that I think a couple things that are interesting of people who can say, I can't believe that, young people would fall for this, that they would be so naive that they don't understand their history. Um, but let's try to lean in just a little bit here. If you're a conservative and you can't understand any of this, how people could get to that point. And the fact of the matter is, Cameron, that if you look at economies, where you have young people who actually don't own anything. So these are people who have rented their entire lives. They don't own cars. I mean, parking, ownership of a vehicle in a big urban area is a nightmare. You don't actually own any physical assets. um, it doesn't really matter to you, seemingly, experientially, on the surface level, whether or not a couple billionaires own it all or whether or not the government owns it all. So your functional experience is going to be not owning anything, likely. Doesn't matter to you on your felt experience on the day to day basis of who owns the thing that it's just like who's making money off of me not owning anything
Mhm.
basically comes down to the question. And then if you have a little bit of anti-capitalist indoctrination and an idea that government is going to solve your problems, this is not a ridiculous leap or a radical thought. You have people when you have a majority who don't own or have a vested physical or tangible connection to the necessities or the needs that they have. This seems to me to be like, yeah, this would make sense that people would be interested in these types of problems. Now, okay, and I can hear already like, oh, okay, these are all kids who got art degrees and work in coffee shops and don't have any money because of that. Da 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 da. Da. Maybe. I mean, there's a part of that, but let's try to steel man the. Let's try to really get behind kind. And so
Yeah.
I don't even know that we have to go to New York City to get this.
Mm.
Um, I did. You look at the. We talked about this a little bit with the Luigi Mangione thing. Like basically, there was a little shrug of like, I shot a rich dude. What's the big deal? Um, that's not just New York City sentiment. Help me.
Yeah.
Like, are you connected with people enough who feel like they're on the disenfranchised or struggle bus enough to think about the the conservative classical capitalist system is not working and has been a failure in my life. Now, I'm not saying that's true. I'm talking about the people who, for the last 5 years, have felt like that is the case in kind of their formative upbringing.
Well, you've done a good job of showing how we don't want to just attack straw man or go after caricatures, right? So let's look at the plausibility structure of American life right now. I think the concept of a plausibility structure is extremely practically useful. This comes to us from Peter Berger and his co-author, whose name is escaping me right now. I think it was Luckman was the last name, but sociologist talking about how I mean, the plausibility structure is just a basic order of thinking. There's a lot that could be said, but that consists of certain norms. Within a plausibility structure, certain things just seem sensible to you. They just seem normal because this is the way, this is the air you breathe. So if you
Mhm.
classic examples, of course, if you are in a red state or in a blue state, your political sensibilities aren't predetermined, but they're going to be shaped in a certain direction because there's a certain political sensibility that just seems to make sense to you. If you're raised in a religious household for a time at least, I mean, obviously you have to make up your own mind, but certain assumptions are simply going to make sense to you. So let's look at the plausibility structure in America just for a second here. For a long time, we've been moving in a consistently more secular direction, just in the sense that in some of our major, it's elite institutions, the notion that there's a higher order to things, that there's a god or anything like that has been firmly set aside. So there's that. We've also been undergoing a long-standing, and again, we're not gonna go into the history of all of this right now, we're just gonna describe some of what's going on. For a long time, we've been tearing up our traditions. This is something that's been happening in the West for a long time. It's this we are a cut flower society, as Os Guinness says, and eventually the flower starts to wilt. So we're starting to see that wilting because it's the flower is cut away from its nourishment and its roots. So for a long time, we've now been disparaging America as a nation, and so we've been focusing a lot on the wickedness of America, of the American past. I mean, in some of the many egregious things that have happened in this nation, it's true. But we've gone so far in one direction now to where, for many young people at least, Nathan, the image of America as a nation is so thoroughly tarnished. So we've moved far away from what was once a civic education, for instance, that was there to engender a larger vision of what it meant to be an American, to instill a healthy sense of patriotism, and to give people a basic understanding of their responsibilities as a citizen. That
Yeah.
has been snuffed out by a number of factors, but yeah, individualism, but also this historical project, which has really been focused on the sins, if you will, of America, but has
Okay, so
gone so far. Yeah, let me pause there.
2 things happen here. So you talked about kind of a patriotic vision of, like, but I'm saying the idea that, like, this is my country, or this is my land, or this is my property, or this is my ideas are represented in my local culture. And so, I mean, so Mandani's talking about defunding the police and not allowing ICE to function in New York City and all, kind of so you're like, how do you get to a totally opposite? And the
Well, can I
best,
get
well, let me give you one illustration of I
yeah.
think is that, um, so there's kind of a joke about would you buy a secondhand rental car? And most people would say, "Yeah, probably not," because I know how people treat rental cars. Like, you abuse the thing that you don't own. And I think you have a pretty large group of young Americans who don't think of American culture as theirs. They don't think of America as something that they own or that they participate in. A very high percentage aren't interested in having children. So it's not like you're setting this up for the future. Um, you're basically just treating everything around you as a rental vehicle, not as if it's actually yours and you have a responsibility toward it. And so we'll come back to, remember what I said at the beginning of this, the question of, like, who solves your problems, and the political implications of how we answer that question will be important. But anyway, the rental car analogy kind of makes sense in my mind to
Yes.
try to inhabit some of the plausibility structure here.
Well, on that note, I mean, again, from a theological and philosophical standpoint, the more you move away from God, just practically speaking, ironically, so Americans have, and a lot of social commentators have pointed this out over the years. Americans have highly esteemed value in America is freedom, whatever that means. We want freedom. Usually for
Mhm.
Americans, that means freedom from constraint within reasonable bounds. But so you want to move more and more away from the notion of God or any kind of higher authority other than humanity, and you want more and more freedom. So this is an oversimplification. If you want it worked out in more detail, you can look at Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, because this is a big argument that he makes in there. But the more you do that, the more you demand freedom, kind of negative freedom, freedom from constraint, and you push away from the notion that we're answerable ultimately to God, then the more the government has to step in and the more control you have to cede to the government for
Mhm.
several different reasons.
Yeah.
Because the government, first of all, you're going to recognize humanity as the highest authority. So the government's going to stand in there. But also, the more freedom you demand, the more your appetites aren't curbed, the less and less self control you're able to exercise, the more control again you have to cede. So then you have cities where there's massive amounts of surveillance. The windows on buses have to be tinted because nobody can control themselves anymore. And if
S-
you look to yeah, let me pause there for a second.
Well, I'll give you the Grandpa Rittenhouse quote on this is that you pay for political dependence in units of freedom.
Correct. Yes, perfectly
So
said.
the way that that works out is, okay, you want a government grocery store, they get to decide what goes in the grocery store.
Yeah.
So if you're going to be dependent on the government grocery store, then you pay in the unit of freedom of not having as many choices, perhaps, as you once did under a different system. Or you want government education, they get to dictate what you say. You want government health care, they get to dictate what counts as a medical emergency. And so for it goes on and on like that. So there's this, I think the fundamental philosophical tension here, or anthropological, I should say, Cameron, is that humans historically have a horrible track record of giving freedom to other humans.
Yes.
And so we get tempted to think that there might be some kind of collective bargaining where we can then politically force other humans to give us the freedom that we crave. And that's where we're like, yeah, that's a bit naive.
So even just with the little that we've already said, if we're thinking responsibly here, it should this doesn't make it right, but what's taking place in New York, what's taking place with younger voters should start making a little bit more sense now. And it's not just blue-haired people working in coffee shops. You have a completely different vision of America that's been happening for a long time.
Well, it's a
One
different
that's
eschatology. It's what do you think is going to
yes.
happen next?
What do you think is gonna happen next? But also, as somebody like Wendell Berry would point out and has pointed out for years, I mean, the sense of ownership and the independence that comes with that, with being able to cultivate your own land, grow your own food, or I mean, some of these pursuits, we tend to think of these conservatives think of these days in survivalist terms. But Wendell Berry's thinking more about how they build your virtue, the virtue of independence, of being able to not only take care of yourself, but also to live in community. And if you live in a healthy,
Mhm.
robust community, which is almost impossible in America these days, in the terms that Wendell Berry is thinking of a kind of a parish idea or model. But if you, in those terms, you have a kind of self-regulating system, or a better word would be you have a kind of natural ecology that's taking place on a social level
Mhm.
where you have people who take care of themselves. And yes, you have Wendell Berry's talked a lot about, and it's in his fiction, that you have the town drunk, or you have some of those elements, or you have the wild cards, but they're kind of, rather than representing a chaotic element, they're taken care of in the community because they're known, they're understood, and again, there's a kind of beautiful natural self-regulation that takes place. Now, this isn't some idealistic hippie vision. This is something that literally can and has happened in the past, and I'm sure there are still tiny little pockets where this is possible, but it's becoming less and less normal in America because we are so fiercely individualistic. We are so secular just in our practical lives. And I'm talking about that's everybody. That practical secularism, living as though practically speaking, God isn't real and we're all in charge and we have to control everything. And also, you can bring in the other major factor here, Nathan, which is that economically it's becoming more and more difficult for a middle class to live well in America. And when
Uh-huh.
you do that, you again militate against ownership. You're stopping people from investing, and you're stopping them from thinking optimistically about the future. But also
Yeah.
that yeah, so I'll stop there for a second. But yeah, I want to say more about the individualism because you see some of the people who are venerated in our society, celebrities, are, I think, some of the most conspicuous examples of this individualism. The notion that you
Mhm.
should live for yourself, don't have children, and if you don't have children, your life's gonna be so much better. I think a lot more can be said about that too.
Yeah, well, let's go back. Let me say just something on the economic vision there also, because if you use a Wendell Berry type vision of um, someone who works the land, lives in a community, enjoys that ecosystem, as you put it. Historically, it would have been possible to buy a house in 20 acres and make enough money from that land to pay for it. Um, Now that that's gone. So property has become a commodity, not a home. So it's a fiat based.
Yeah,
It's not rooted in any actual value. So you can have somebody from Silicon Valley can buy 1,000 farms, and somebody who grew up on a farm will never be able to afford one of those farms. So
right,
I think even you take somebody who's working a basic marketing job in New York City that's going to be replaced by AI in 3 years and feels like they're putting in 75 hours a week and are making less money in a year than somebody who's investing in a crypto coin stock
right.
in 2 days. There's a weird um, tension between how people feel about like the wealth that is created now feels different than the wealth that was created in the past, where it feels like the wealth that was created in the past produced a tangible
It feels abstract.
asset.
Yeah,
The Rockefellers figured out how to get oil more cheaply to
right.
America
Mhm.
and made money. The
Yeah,
Waltons figured out how to get milk to Americans more cheaply and made a lot of money. Carnegie, the steel, the whole. Now you have people who are like figured out how to hack a marketing algorithm to leverage a cryptocurrency for a week and they're set for life. And you're like, what value did that actually provide to
Yeah.
community and humanity? And I'm not saying that people who don't do that might not be super generous with their money or something. It feels like our economics are way more abstract from the ecology culturally that we live in. And I
Mhm.
think that creates a lot of the anti big money kind of, and there have always been people protesting against wealth disparities for sure. I'm just saying we're watching those wealth disparities multiply in orders of magnitude without seeing a direct benefit back into the ecos. Like it we're using the same words, but I can see how for young people it feels very different than for anybody who owned property and has had a stable
Mhm.
job since 2020. Everything since then has been very different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and how to the vision of happiness in our society is again so small and so narrow, and I'm just speaking descriptively. The notion that you find subjective satisfaction in a private vision of your own. Subjective also necessarily so that it's not a vision that is imposed on you by anybody else. But so on these terms, it's hard not to see it often as just a real just kind of a slide into some sort of consumerism. Or
Mhm.
I think of somebody like Seth Rogen or recently Chapel Roan, who basically both made statements in different ways against children. Seth Rogen, arguing that we've talked about this on the podcast before, that he and his partner have no kids, and it's great because they can, smoke weed in bed on Saturday mornings and watch cartoons. So that
Oh,
is
I know
certainly
people
a
with
vision.
kids who do that too, but so, I mean, I'm not sure that's a
Sure.
good
Well,
argument,
yeah, sure.
but
But so, I mean, so certainly a vision of self indulgence. Is it an actual picture of real lasting fulfillment? Or Chapel Roan saying, "All my friends with kids right now are in hell." Alright, well, what she means is that they have to, I mean, self-sacrifice is built into the structural arrangement of having children.
okay,
Everybody who has
okay,
kids
whoa,
knows
hang
that.
on, hang on, hang on. Wait, you're
Yeah.
introducing a whole new category here. Self-sacrifice. So, when you say self-sacrifice, here's where I wanna get back to. It's like, who solves your problems? And if you're living in a culture where you feel like no matter how hard I work, I will never be able to solve this problem,
Mhm.
then you're going to start saying something like, "This is only an issue that can be solved at the government level." And then all of a sudden, big government and big promises from government, regardless of the fuzziness of how this is actually paid for, suddenly sounds alluring and appealing. And so I really do think, Cameron, that ultimately at the end of the day, this comes back to the question of agency and who do you think is going to solve these problems? So yeah, is having kids um require sacrifice? Yeah, sure. But my wife and I, your wife and you guys think we're like, yeah, but we can rise to meet this challenge. Um,
Oh, we would say you're
and so
made
it,
for
it,
it.
it
Of course, as
yeah,
Christians,
we're
you're
yeah
made to live for other people, and if you
yeah.
do
So
the
so
opposite.
but I'm saying we're assuming a Christian anthropology of the agency of the individual to rise to meet the task of fulfilling certain roles around us that we were created for as humans. And we would categorically reject that the government is the end all be all solution to the deep existential and cultural problems around us. So I, I'm I'm pushing us, Cameron, here into recognizing that if you're listening to this and you're like, what are these guys talking about? What we're trying to say is that if some of these political changes shock you, it's because you don't fully understand the degree to which your Christian faith has shaped and formed the way that you think about culture and humanity and human agency and responsibility, where the conflicts really lie, and what the deepest needs of humanity actually are. That's the point we're
Yeah,
making.
that's the point we're making. And also, this way of living runs counter to the way human beings are actually made. So you're made for a higher degree of freedom, for instance, than just freedom from all constraint. You're made to be a certain way. There's freedom for as well. So you're made to live for others. You're made to live first and foremost for God and neighbor. But the way that translates practically is you're made to serve those around you, and they in turn are made to serve you. There's a harmony that that happens here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but while we're just pushing into this and getting ourselves in the mud hole, let's push this a little bit further, which is to say, okay, so you have New York City, then there's the continued Trump and Musk feudship, friendship, whatever. As of the recording of
Frenemies.
this, yeah, frenemies.
Just
Musk is
just
saying, if you pass the big beautiful bill
Mhm.
and increase
Yep.
the deficit to this degree, I'm starting a new political party. And so that would be an option. It's like just a ton of money thrown at yeah, who knows? These
Yep.
things rarely ever work out like anybody thinks. But one of the tricks I think, Cameron, is to recognize is that both political parties that we have in the United States have basically been playing the same game, which is borrow money from the future to fund the
Mhm.
wishes that we have now. So this is not a Democrat or Republican thing at the current moment. This is borrowing a ton of money that we don't have from future generations and then maybe printing some more money in order for the instant gratification. So it's a cultural American thing. It's not a political party sort of thing that we're embodying and living in right now. So it's not like, oh, we just got to elect a different. This is where it requires some strategic Christian thinking for young Christian American adults to
Mhm.
say, how are we going to parse reality, the wants and needs and wishes of our own hearts, and think about what it means for the church to become an ecosystem rather than a Sunday morning event in order for us to live well what we know to be true about who God is, how he created humans to live and function in relationship to each other, how he created us to take care and have actual responsibilities of the physical assets around us and do those in a way that are
Mhm.
economically stable and emotionally satisfactory and relationally harmonizing. It's a big task, and I just don't see any voices out there right now saying, "And this is how we would go about doing this vision of reality." Everything gets sucked up into an economic or a partisan political conversation, and I think that just seems to be a massive distraction from the core vision and heart of what the church really could be about in this time. And so, um, I'm not solving that problem right now. I'm just expressing a longing for that to be a conversation on the table.
Yeah, I think we're in desperate need of constructive thinkers. One kind of growing area of interest I'm seeing on along those lines, Nathan, is that responsible thinkers, I'm saying, are all saying we need to think smaller in the sense that we need to focus on our immediate spheres of influence, or really just our communities, and pour in
Mhm.
there on a local level. And I know that local is a very trendy word, but just meaning the place where you exercise the most influence as a citizen, but also just as a neighbor and as a person. Patrick Deneen saying that. A lot of the folks at Mere Orthodoxy are saying that. There are a number of, Front Porch Republic is another place where you see a lot of writers who converge on that theme. And these are people who come from different sides of the political aisle as well. So that's interesting too. But but they are in agreement on the fact that we need to build where we can and in responsible ways, and where we make a difference, we need to build up a responsible citizenry again, and that we need virtue. That's the big word that I always come back to here. That's the word the founding fathers will use. You can't have, this grand American experiment doesn't work without virtuous people, people who
Mhm.
can control themselves. And so in that sense, Nathan, just as a parting kind of word, I would say we as Christians have an especial responsibility, not to save America necessarily, but I mean, maybe that's a happy byproduct, but to lean into what we would call righteousness, seeking first the kingdom of God and aiming to obey Christ together in our churches. And in that way, perhaps be a creative minority who help in restoring a more holistic vision of what it means to be an American nowadays.
Yeah. Well, so but this I think, Cameron, is well, this is a separate podcast on what the American dream really is, but I think
Yeah.
what we do wanna recognize is that the purpose of living is not just staying alive. The Christian
Ah,
vision is
ah,
not how do
ah,
we
just kidding.
yeah, yeah, that's yeah. It's not how do I pay the rent, pay my insurance, pay for food,
Yep.
success. It's like, so when
Mere
Jesus says,
survival.
seek first the kingdom, yeah, mere survival is suddenly becoming, for many people, the American dream. And I think Jesus's version of this is, don't worry about all that stuff. Like, get on with the important things in life. And I think there's we don't want to sound like we're saying, just get on with the important stuff in life, when there are a lot of people who are trying to figure out how to survive. So that, I think, is a multi-layered challenge for the church, is to recognize that the vision that God has for you, your family, and for your church is certainly to be able to pay your bills, to have your daily needs, um, to rely on the Lord, be thankful for your daily bread. But then the bigger question is, so what is the purpose of life after that? And so that's my um, concern here, Cameron, is that we're among a generation of people whose survival is the goal, and don't have the capacity to think about the fullness of what it is that it means to be human, and maybe what it is that God has in store for them, and a really creative vision of how to live their lives. So, this project I'm working on, there are a lot of other people out there, and it's not going to be showy, it's not going to be flashy, it's not going to be big, it's not going to have 200,000 followers, um, but it is a project that we all need to be working on and to be thinking about. So, um, yeah, if you're a little bit older than this and you're listening in, you might be like, "What's the big deal?" There's a lot going on under the surface. There's a lot of frustration among young people right now, and I think the church, as a multi generational structure, will be one of the places where some of these solutions can be best worked out. So, all this to say, we're optimistic for the future, because we know about the who's really running the world. But at the same time, we need to go slow and recognize that there is some real heartache and some real difficulties for an entire generation. And if we don't get that sorted out, if you think politics are weird now, just you wait and see. So let's not do things because we think the sky is falling, but let's do things because we actually have a vision of the good. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.